Good evening, everyone. My name is Samantha.
And I'm Neil.
And welcome to Dialogue on Divinity. Neil and I are members of the Community at the Crossing. The Community at the Crossing is an ecumenical program for spiritual formation in the heart of New York City. We have spent a year in prayer and discernment, biblical and theological formation, intentional community, service, and mission, and have chosen as our brothers and sisters people who have radically different perspectives and experiences from ourselves. As Christians, we believe that there is far more that unites us than divides us, and that our world is in desperate need of people who can model true unity, which is born from reconciliation, truth, and the humility of shared life. Dialogue on Divinity is a series presented by the Community at the Crossing as an intentional, I'm reading the same thing twice. Dialogues on Divinity is a way for us to support the community by opening up what we learn through our spiritual formation to anybody who would be interested. And I'm super excited about tonight's panel specifically because we have this wonderful panel for interreligious dialogue.
Thank you, Samantha. Everything that we do in the Community at the Crossing is supported by people like you, generous people who join us for prayer, for events like this, and who support us materially with donations. I know a lot of you already have done so, but I hope that you'll feel moved at some point during this event to do so again. On the front of the programs that you have, there's a QR code that leads you to our website where you can donate. I hope you will give cheerfully, joyously, and generously. One practical thing is that when you came in, you got a card where you can write questions that you might have for our panelists during the event. There'll be a moment in the middle where we'll pause so that you can write those questions down. But at any point, if you've filled your card out, you can lift it up, and Sam or I will come and pick it up. If you need another card, because you're full of questions, like I am, then we will give you one. And so without further ado, I am very excited to introduce the moderator of today's panel, Canon Eva Suarez, who is the Canon for Community Engagement here at the Cathedral Church of St. John the Divine.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Samantha, and thank you to the Community at the Crossing for helping to make this event available to the wider Cathedral community. This talk was planned a long time ago, back at the beginning of the community's program year, and it's only felt more timely and more vital as it's approached. So I want to thank our panelists for being here. I'll get to your bios in just a second, because I was asked to say a word about this space. We're grateful to be here at the Cathedral with its long history of interreligious engagement. You may have noticed the large menorahs that flank our high altar as you entered. They were actually a gift to our former bishop, William Manning, from the founder of the New York Times, Adolph Oakes, to thank him for his efforts to improve Jewish-Christian relations. So they've been a part of our history at the Cathedral from the beginning, this kind of interreligious dialogue. More than one person in this room said, the last time I was here, an object lesson from Dr. Deutsch on silencing your phones. I'll invite you to do that now. Multiple people tonight have said the last time they were in this room was for an interreligious conversation on the value of water. So it's great to be doing this here at the Cathedral and connects us to our long history of this kind of dialogue in this place. A few words about our program tonight. The first is that these are religious folks, not religious officials. They are representing their experience, not speaking officially as ambassadors of their tradition. And they all agreed that it was important that we enter the dialogue with that in mind. And we're asking you to write your questions, and we'll break midway through to give you a chance to write down questions that you're having, and again at the end. So thank you for being thoughtful as you do that. Now to introduce our panelists, we have Sister Celia Deutsch, who is a sister of Notre Dame de Sion and a research scholar in the religion department at Barnard College, as well as serving on the Community for Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn. We have Rabbi Burton Visotzky, who is a professor of Midrash and Interreligious Studies at Jewish Theological Seminary just up the street, and he also serves as the director of the Milstein Center for Interreligious Dialogue. We have the very Reverend Dr. Patrick Malloy.
It's like she didn't know my name.
The program says Patrick Malloy. He is the 11th Dean of the Cathedral and has a long history as a professor of liturgics and a long history of leadership in the Episcopal Church. And finally, Dr. Hussein Rashid, who is the Assistant Dean for Religion and Public Life at Harvard Divinity School. So it's certainly an august panel that we've assembled today, and thank you all for being here and sharing so generously with us. So I'm going to start with what feels like a softball, but I imagine you'll all have a lot to say. And that question is, what is interreligious dialogue? What does it mean to gather here to do this? What do our different faiths have to say to each other, and why does it matter? And I'll let anyone who feels called start. Thank you, sister.
Hello? This works? Okay. Hussein just looked at me because I was sharing with him just before we began. The Pope was in Verona, Italy, in northern Italy, over the weekend at an event. And it, of course, it coincided with the celebration of Pentecost. And so he was talking in a reflection about the Holy Spirit. And he said, the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of God, is the one who prevents us from trying to make everyone alike. And I thought that was marvelous, and especially thinking about that in light of today, in this evening's event, and also thinking about that in light of the struggles in our country, struggles politically, and I don't know about the Episcopalians, but the Roman Catholic communities is really, really polarized in many ways, reflecting, I think, the broader social polarization. And I thought to myself, that is beautiful. The Spirit of God keeps us from trying to make everybody in one image. And so that's my beginning. In terms of how do I understand interreligious dialogue or interreligious relationships? I understand it from many perspectives. It has many shapes. And it's the kind of thing we're doing tonight with people who engage in this, almost, I hate to use this word, but professionally. And that's one form of dialogue. But there are others. There is what's called a dialogue of action, which is people in the streets together, working for a more just society. There is a dialogue of religious experience, which is the kind of experience of coming together to share deeply our religious traditions, whether it be in a silent prayer, whether it be attending one another's services. And there's also something called, and by the way, this is all coming out of a church document, but it's not meant to be restrictive, but it's kind of a sampling of different ways in which we engage one another. What's called the dialogue of life. People living together, being neighbors, being kind to one another in the subway, talking about their lives, enjoying one another's food. One of my most profound experiences of this kind of thing was, I'd lived in a part of our neighborhood over near Coney Island Avenue for many years, and it's called Little Karachi. And I used to take any faxing I had to be done, and I always had to count on an extra 20 or 30 minutes because the owner wanted to engage in conversation about what I thought as a Christian, or how our scriptures treated this character or that character, and he wanted to share with me what he thought and what he believed, and it was a very profound and important kind of conversation over the years, and it was important to me. I don't know about Mr. Ali, but it was very important to me. And so that's how I understand it. I understand it as something that allows me to grow as a Catholic Christian, even as I hope conversations help people like Mr. Ali be a better Muslim, or even, dare I say, Bert to be a better Jew, or now that I know Pat, to be a better Episcopalian. So, you too, Hussein and Eva, why should I exclude you? but it's something that helps us to grow and to grow together, even and particularly because of our differences. And to know that there is a God who is greater than all of us and greater than all of our traditions, which can be a little scary at times. And I'm going to leave it there because I think...
I want to thank you, and as often is the case, engage in something you said, because you talked about what Pope Francis said about, I assume it was Francis, how the Spirit gives us the ability to be different. And as we were being introduced, I noted, we had very short bios. And if you had had a longer bio from me, you would have heard that I served for a number of years as a dean at the Jewish Theological Seminary's graduate school. So we got 1, 2, 3 deans. Somewhat different kinds of deans, but 3 deans and a lot of academics up here. But for me, the most interesting and important thing, and I'm going to relate it to Jewish law, is that I'm up here with friends, people I care about, and that includes Pat, who only because of this program did I have the privilege of meeting, and almost from the first moment we met, we clicked. Jews are commanded to love our neighbor as ourself. It sounds very simple and it's very complicated. First of all, who's our neighbor? I can't ask that question without thinking of a minister. Some of you might know him, Fred Rogers. And, I wanted to be his neighbor. And loving your neighbor is complicated. There are, and I'm embarrassed to say this, I'm looking at the JTS students, there are rabbis in our tradition who say the neighbor is the one who is most like you. In other words, you're only commanded to love other Jews, which I find abhorrent. I also find it wrong. It's bad exegesis. And since I am a professor of rabbinic interpretation of Scripture, I feel comfortable saying it's wrong. Because the context in Leviticus makes it clear that our neighbor is the non-Jewish neighbor. So I'm commanded to love Celia and to love Hussein and to love Pat. And loving is rich. It's not necessarily physical love, it's consideration. And the rabbis who are very practical say, so what does that mean? It means that just as I would want my honor to be protected, I would protect your honor. But then they take it very practically and they say, and just as I might have an economic advantage, I should make sure that my neighbor has it. So later tonight I'm going to give you the envelope of coupons I've been clipping for you all. But think about that, because that's real. Were I to share it, notice, were I to share it, it would actually be an act of loving my neighbor, because I'm giving you a financial benefit that I would also have for myself. And that equality, that idea that we should all be on the same plane, and that means that when we have intellectual discourse, as we're hoping to do tonight, as Celia said, I will learn from you, and from your own practice of tradition, I will learn to be a better person, a better human, and also a better Jew.
God, I always hate going after Bert. Yeah, you want to buffer me? Yeah, if you want to buffer me, go ahead. Yeah, go down.
Okay.
Yeah, buffer me so I don't have to go after Bert.
Okay. So we were talking earlier about where we grew up. I grew up in Appalachia, in a tiny little town in a holler where everyone virtually was a Christian. There was a synagogue. Actually, there were two synagogues. I never met anyone who went near them. There were no Muslims, as far as I know, and no members of other religious traditions. Everyone was Christian.
Do you know why there were two synagogues?
No, why? There's a punchline.
This is a classic Jewish tradition. There are two synagogues so that there can be the one you go to and the one you wouldn't step foot in.
Yeah. For us, that was the Methodist Church. Anyway, just being real. So anyway, so I think there's a lot of, at least the United States, like that. I mean, I think where you never have to encounter someone of a religion other than yours. We have two house guests now from England, and they are amazed. And they're from London, and they are absolutely amazed at the diversity of New York City. They're like reveling in it. They love it. I think when you live in a place where you don't have to bump into people who are different than you, I think probably you can do one of two things. You can either sort of demonize them as the utterly other, or I think you can just say, oh, well, we're really all the same. We really are the same. Aren't we all the same? And I think what happens living cheek to jowl in a place like New York, and you were talking, Sister, about the dialogue of life, you know. I think that's the way most people really do interreligious dialogue. They don't do this. They just live with other people. And I think what I find anyway, is we are very much alike, but we really are different. And as I meet people who are Muslims or Jews or Hindus, not so much Roman Catholics, but even then a little bit really, I say, this person doesn't see the world the way I do. There's something, the myth, they have a different myth. And that myth shapes how they see the world. And so that happens to me in the dialogue of life is, I'm sort of disabused of either thing, either that we're all the same, or that we're all so incomprehensible to one another that we're incompatible. Which in a funny kind of way is an odd place to be, you know, to say, you know, Bert's Judaism and my Christianity really they're different. But I can respect Bert. And as he said, you know, we met and we got along fine, but I know Bert sees the world differently than I do. And I just I accept it, but I can't deny it.
Now I hate going after you too. Next time, just let me go first so I don't have to go after anybody. And next time, we'll do it the other way around. Okay. First of all, thank you all for having me here, for the invitation, Community at the Crossing, all of you for being here today. I also want to thank Community at the Crossing. I spent most of the day with them, and a lot of what I'm going to say was developed whether they realize it or not in conversation with them today. So you will probably hear a rehash of, you'll get the 30-second hour I spent with you. So, you know, you can ask for your money back at the end of the program. But I want to start out, the reason I looked at Celia when you asked this question, Eva, is because when she told me this story about the Pope, I said, that's a great launching off point for me, right? The Holy Spirit will keep us off from, I'm forgetting, the Holy Spirit will keep us from all being the same. And there's a verse of the Qur'an, 49:13, for those of you who want to look it up. We created you tribes and nations that you may know one another. This is one that's quoted a lot in interfaith work, right? That God created us different so that we can know one another, like we can't know each other without being different. And I think that's important. But I think it's also important to look, for me as a Muslim, to look at the Quranic text where God has given all these epithets that are in contradiction with one another, that are repetitive of one another. Like the most common one is Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. It's translated in English as the compassionate, the merciful. But it's basically, you know, variations of the same. So thinking about God as kaleidoscopic, that no matter how we look at God, we can never get a firm vision or view of what God is. So if we can't grasp God in God's totality, how do we attempt to grasp God's creation in its totality and say, this is right, this is wrong, this doesn't belong, this does belong? To me, that strikes me as an act of hubris. And to your specific question about interreligious dialogue, I grew up in New York in the 70s and 80s. I don't know how many of you were here in the 70s and 80s, but let's just say it wasn't quite as Disney as it is now. More public art. That's how I like to frame it. There was a lot more public art, which I miss a little bit, to be honest with you. But we didn't have this idea of interfaith or interreligious dialogue. You were just hanging out, right? So I grew up in Queens, in Rego Park, in Forest Hills. Is anybody here familiar with Forest Hills, with Queens? I always feel weird asking in Manhattan. Okay, good, somebody. Okay, good. You've been at least through it, right? It's sort of like, you know, see, nobody shouted out Queens. That's how I know I'm in the wrong audience. But Forest Hills at one point was probably the most diverse Jewish community outside of Tel Aviv in the world. So, and I say this as a frame of reference because I think this speaks to sort of my experience, because I went to school in Forest Hills. Is my best friend in elementary school was Ashkenazi Jewish. His parents had emigrated from Russia. The guy I bought my comic books from was an Iranian Jewish fruit seller. The music we went to was Bukharan music festivals at the temple on Queens Boulevard, if you know the one I'm talking about. Right, so this is sort of the space in which I grew up. But I wasn't hanging out with them because they were Jewish. I was hanging out with them because Friday nights he had the best dinner out of all my friends, right? Like that's where, to your point about speaking about food, that's where you go and hang out. And then if I ended up at temple the next day or that night and then possibly the next day, okay, fine. My parents were just like, is he getting pork? No? Okay, that's a good place for him to be at. You know, like that's fine. Nobody asked about the wine, which was a separate conversation. But, you know, but I think that there is this idea of living together as a way to, as really that's the type of work that we do. As Bert says, this is about relationships, this is about friendship. And we've had this conversation, he and I and Reverend Chloe Breyer. Did Chloe make it here? She did not, okay. We co-authored an article where we had this conversation where I think the way we understand love in English in the United States is a very Christianized concept. And I find it very difficult to engage with, right? The call is to justice. And justice is what brings us equity and equality, and that's the expression of love. But love itself is not actually the way to get it. And we've had this conversation, and that's neither here nor there, right? But it's that point of difference. But thinking through how do we get to points of justice, how do we build justice, and that comes through relationality, that comes through connections. And the last thought, speaking to Pat's point, and this is what I'm grateful to the community I spent time with today, is that I do think interreligious dialogue, when we look for the commonalities, is that foundation building. We need that. We're all rectangles, we're all trying to build that foundation. When we don't get to difference, we're not building beyond the foundation. So it can get buried, it can get covered. The idea that we are different and we don't fit together neatly. You know, the Quran tells us God is the light of the heavens and the earth. Allah notice some about the ardi. God is the light of the heavens and the earth. You cannot look at the light of God. It's too blinding. But when you have all those pieces that don't fit well together, the shadows, the patterns, the little bits of light that come through, that gives us an inkling of the divine, coming back to the idea of the kaleidoscope. And it's through difference that we actually get to see God more fully by understanding we can't see God in its totality.
Well, so to jump around our prepared questions a little bit, clearly there's a lot that binds us together, and there was a thread of relationship through these answers. But to sort of pick up that point of difference where you left off, we also have deeply held beliefs that can be at odds with each other. So how do you navigate those potentially exclusive claims from your own traditions in interfaith settings? And particularly if you're with people you don't know as well as some of you know each other.
Can we go out of order? Because
Oh, there's no order. You guys.
Okay. You don't have to go first? Okay. I think I just don't want to. I thought we had a rule established here. I think for me, the issue of exclusive claims is not much of a problem when I'm speaking to people who have different religions than I do. I think for me, I have problems with exclusivistic claims when I'm talking to other Christians. So, for example, no one comes to the Father except through me. I mean, you and I we're smart people, we can sort of parse that. But there are Christians with whom that can only mean one thing, and it certainly is not what it means to me. And I think I think that currently, I think it's wonderful that we're having this dialogue. Interreligious dialogue is very important. But I think right now in the United States, the problem is not that people of different religions are at odds. It's that the majority religion, Christianity, is internally broken. And so it creates a kind of a friction. There's a friction that lives within me because there are Christians who absolutely would disagree with the way I would interpret those seemingly exclusivistic texts. So I want to begin with that because honestly, I think you and I can figure out what those exclusivistic terms mean, how you understand them within your tradition, how I understand them with mine, and we can part friends. It's not so with other Christians.
Thank you, Pat. I think it's not just that the Christian polity is broken. There's a fault line across. I can only speak for Judaism. I'll let Hussein speak for Islam, but it's across maybe progressive versus conservative religions, because there is unquestionably a fault line like that in the Jewish world. So I want to take this in two separate directions. The first one is Jewish claims to exclusivity, Jewish claims to be the chosen people, and it is a claim that we confront regularly. When we say the prayer over the wine on Friday nights, when we say Kiddush, part of the Kiddush includes the phrase, and I'm going to say it in Hebrew, because I want you to hear the word I'm going to emphasize, Asher bachar banu mi kol ha'amim, mi kol ha'amim. God, you have chosen us from amongst all the people. Many years ago, I was in Jerusalem at the Sabbath table of Jacob Milgrom, a great rabbi, and for those of you who know your Bible commentary, he wrote the Anchor Bible commentary on the book of Leviticus. And Jack Milgrom changed one letter. He sang Asher bachar banu im kol ha'amim, not mi kol ha'amim, but im kol ha'amim. God, you have chosen us along with all the people. And that's how I say Kiddush on Friday night, because I learned it from my teacher, Jack Milgrom. And so chosenness right there is diluted in really a very positive way, because to be in relationship to God is to be chosen. The other thing I want to say is that Jews have different expectations for Jewish relationship with God, and on that I'm talking about the commandments, than we expect non-Jews. Jews, in theory, are commanded 613 commandments. For those of you taking notes, just write a whole bunch. Many of those commandments, in fact, cannot be practiced because there's no longer a temple standing in Jerusalem. Thank God. But non-Jews have far fewer. Most medieval rabbis would agree that non-Jews are only obligated to 7 commandments. So those of you taking notes, far fewer. So what's the difference between a whole bunch and far fewer? We don't deny that non-Jews have relationship with God. We just think that God made it a whole lot harder for Jews to be in relationship with God. And that claim to exclusivity is an enormous burden. And I think people need to appreciate that we accept upon ourselves a burden. And in these times, that burden can seem liberating, but it also can seem crushing.
I found myself putting ditto marks after almost every word Pat said. because actually the people that I find it hardest to share with theologically are very often fellow Christians and sometimes fellow Catholics, depending on who they are, because we've got the whole range. And I think all of our denominations have the whole spectrum of ways in which people believe and hold their traditions. Where I am right now, it doesn't cause me any problems. And it's mainly because it's of the people I'm with. I'm in an immigrant parish, and folks just have a whole lot more to worry about. They are profoundly pious, and I have learned more about being a Catholic Christian living in that parish than I ever have from any other communities, with the exception of my own religious order. And they are not hung up on a lot of the kinds of exclusiveness that sometimes more literally minded people can get caught in. So in terms of my personal experience, I don't have to worry about some of that. I have to worry about some of that in the broader world, the broader Catholic world, obviously, and in the broader Christian world. But in terms of the day-to-day and the professional circles I live in, in some ways it's not good for me because I don't learn to really engage with people in my own tradition who are profoundly different from me. One experience I had, though, was a couple of years ago, and the Roman Catholic world is engaged in a synod process, and it's a multi-year process all over the world. And the bottom line about it is that people are gathering in small groups to exchange deeply on what matters. And in some places it's being done better than in others. But I was asked to be part of a national group of theologians, even though I'm an historian. But the person who asked me is a good friend of mine. She's in charge of this process. So she said, I know you're not a theologian, you're an historian, and please do this. So I was put in a group, and it was breakout screen, on a Zoom screen. And we were asked to each person go around the circle and say what was our deepest concern right now, our single deepest concern for the Catholic Church in this country. And the first person to speak gave an answer, and I could feel my shoulders go, like, oh no. And I thought, Celia, just be quiet and listen. All you have to do in this process is really listen. So it made the circle, and then we came back. By the end of that hour, and it was only an hour, I felt like I could like this guy. I could like him. He's a human being. He's not just, this person I write off as a hyper-conservative Catholic, and I don't like, this tendency. But he's a human being. And I think, what would happen to our country if our country, all of us did that? The demonization would certainly be broken, and we would see one another as human beings. Who didn't agree necessarily, or we might get to agree. We might come to a meeting point, but not necessarily. But we would be human beings to one another. And I find that a really, it's a hopeful thing.
Before you answer, I'm just going to say, I was going to pause for people to write questions, but I see people writing. So just a reminder, as you have questions, please write them down, and you can raise your card for them to be collected. Sorry, thank you.
No, not at all. Thank you. I will be relatively quick because I think most everybody said what I wanted to say. I think what has been illuminating in this conversation for me is I think, Ava, you framed the question as exclusionary. And I think for me what's been illuminating this conversation is that actually we should have exclusionary positions. That's what our theologies are, is they are inherently exclusionary. How do I know who you are without these boundaries? What I'm hearing, though, is we're having problems with exclusivist language, right? Like, who is not worthy of us talking to, whether it's intra-faith or interfaith, who's not worthy of us. I don't know how many of you are familiar with a man named Jack Chick.
Oh, yeah.
But he does these little cartoon tracks, Chick tracks,
Chick track.
about why everybody's going to hell besides him. It's a fascinating, just look it up. It's chick.com. I promise you it's perfectly safe for work. But, you know, for me, he's sort of my standard bearer of the exclusivist theology, which says, you're going to hell because you've got the Pope. You're going to hell because you don't eat bacon. You're going to hell because, where's Jesus? Right? I'm going to hell because I worship a moon god. You're a woman, you're going to hell definitionally. So, I mean, plus all the other stuff. So anything you want to tell me about yourself, I'll tell you what going to hell. I'll pull out the Jack Chick hat. I've done this long enough that. But like that exclusivist language is, I think, much more damaging and threatening to serious community building. So I'm quite comfortable with our theology saying, well, actually, no, we don't agree and we're not going to agree because that's what theology is. But to your point, can we still build and create? I will end with one funny story, though, on the 613. So I was teaching a class at Barnard on religion and popular culture. A student came in with a cap that had 613 on it. And I thought, oh, that's a clever way of showing you're Orthodox. He had a cap with a 613, and, you know, he didn't want it. But if you know type moments. And I see him pull out, my class would meet in the afternoons. I'd let students bring in lunch. He brought out a deli sandwich with cheese on it. And I was like, meat, cheese, not one of the 613. So I was like, what do you think that hat means? And he's like, it's a New York area code. You bought this in Brooklyn. Yes, I did. I can tell you where you bought it in Brooklyn, too. So, poor child never wore that hat again.
Can I just jump in for a moment? Because listening to Celia, I had an insight. And I don't know if it's an original insight, and I will teach it now and quote it in your name. But you said there was this doctrinaire guy, and he made your shoulders cringe, but then you listened. And as you said that, my thought, which is always my thought because it's my own rebuke to myself, is that listening might be the hardest skill any of us have to master. And then it struck me that there is a verse of Scripture that Jews recite morning and night, and it is kind of central. If there's such a thing as a Jewish creed, this is it. And what we say is, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, which is often translated, Hear, O Israel, H-E-A-R, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. But thanks to you, I'm going to translate it differently. I think Shema Yisrael, because Shema is a command form, means Jews, listen. And if you learn how to do that, then God can be one. So thank you.
Thank you. Midrash in real time. So these kinds of conversations, though we've stayed in a pretty positive place so far, these conversations can feel particularly vital right now, and I think particularly difficult as the conflict in Israel and Gaza has led to so much devastation. So all of you are connected in some way as well to universities, either as professors or, in the case of the cathedral, as an institutional neighbor to Columbia Barnard. So what have these months since October 7th been like for you as religious leaders, particularly in the university context? And what have your communities needed from you, and have you felt able to provide it?
With your permission, I'm going to go first because I may have a special status here. I don't know if you can see, I'm wearing this little yellow doodad ribbon in my lapel, which is for the hostages. On October 7th, in addition to the 1,200 Israelis who were killed, lots of hostages were taken. Not just Jewish hostages, hostages from 5 different religions, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, and Hindu, and from many, many, many different countries. But among those hostages is my cousin Hirsch. So this has been a daily pain for me that a member of my family who I know and who I love, and who some of you may know recently, is 3 weeks ago, appeared in a video. So now at least we know he's alive. Of course, knowing he's alive makes the stakes all the higher that we want to get him back. It's very difficult. But tonight at dinner, I sat across or down the table from someone wearing a keffiyeh. And I quietly said to myself, And then I realized that I would be comfortable wearing a keffiyeh and this yellow ribbon because I want there to be a Palestinian state, and I'm thoroughly sick and shamed of how many innocent Palestinians we have killed. And I've written that publicly in JTS publications, and though I try, although I fail, to not do politics around JTS with my students, I think my students know where I stand on this issue. But the discourse we engage in daily is not a good medium for nuance, let alone holding two possibly disparate ideas in opposition. So if I have anything to teach and say on this, it's you can hold two ideas at the same time. And you could want Palestinians to live and be well and have a state, and you can want Israelis to live and be well and have a state, and please God bring the hostages home.
Thank you.
I'm deeply grateful for what you just said. And when we met, it was not long after October 7th, and we talked about your nephew? Cousin. The reason I'm grateful is, one of the first things I did after what happened on October 7th happened was I called Joe Potasnik, and I asked him to tell him what we wanted to help any way we could.
He's the president of the New York Board of Rabbis. And
then I asked him if there was anybody, if he had any relatives who had been impacted by that, if any of the hostages or the people killed were his relatives. And he said, well, all of them. And I thought well, of course. And at that point, it was all very simple. At that point, I knew exactly what my position was on the whole thing and how awful it was. But it's not so simple anymore, and that's why I'm grateful for what you said. It sort of gives me permission to accept my own confusion. I think one of the problems here at the Cathedral, we made a commitment to being available to people of goodwill wherever they found themselves in this conflict. I think what makes it difficult is that the categories have become so confused. And by that I mean, for example, there's anti-Zionism, there's anti-Semitism, there's anti-Islam, there's anti-Hamas, there's anti-Netanyahu, there's pro-this, and the terms are difficult to keep parsed. And so when you are like we are and you're a public institution, we certainly don't want not to take positions, but the positions are so unbelievably complicated. So it's just, for us at the Cathedral, this has been a real struggle.
I'm deeply appreciative of the question, and I want to be conscious of what I say might reveal things about students that they would rather not be revealed. So I will speak generically, perhaps more generically than my colleagues have spoken. So I'm a Columbia alum. We found that we had that in common. I'm a Columbia alum. So I was spending a lot of time on the weekends at the encampment here, as well as what would eventually become the encampment at Harvard with my students there. I say this as a way of positioning myself that I have been committed to Palestinian independence for as long as I can remember what political consciousness is like. And at the same time, I can condemn what happened on October 7th because my commitment to Palestine is through the lens of justice and human dignity. And if that is the commitment, if that is the clarity, then you cannot revel in somebody else's death, you cannot revel in somebody else's suffering as a means to justice and equity, because that is antithetical to what it is we should be working towards. And I was, we recently organized, my office recently organized a conference up at Harvard Divinity School, where we invited Reverend Kelly Brown Douglas. Some of you may be familiar with the name. She said something in her talk that just has reconfigured the way I see the world. And if you've never heard her speak, like, yeah, go do that. Take some time. But she was quoting this verse, or this from Scripture: "The first shall be last, and the last shall be first." And she said, you know, for the longest time, I didn't understand that, because it's an inversion, right? The first will be last, the last will be first. Doesn't that just reproduce the questions of power that we're talking about? And she said, but what if it's not an inversion? What if it's a circle? What if it's the first is the last and the last is the first, and you can't tell the difference anymore? And I'm like, oh dang, that's my weekend gone. But to me, this is what we're talking about, is that trying to be heard, that where is our commitment to human life in all of this? Where is our commitment to human dignity in all this? Where is our commitment? If this is a tit for tat, Hamas did this because Israel did that, and Israel did this because Hamas did that, it's not a game I'm interested in playing, right? It's not, and I'm not talking about the simplistic eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. I'm like, this is a moment where we can change and rethink power structures. And why is it that every moment we're reinforcing the same power structures that brought us here? Do we think that doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results is a sign of sanity? And so for me, this is what I've been trying to offer the sites that I go to say, yes, stand for Palestine, but do not forget what is at stake for people who are suffering in this. How do we open that space for them? And I'm not trying to both sides this. I want to be very clear. Palestinian liberation is first and foremost in my mind. This has been going on for 75 years. And it cannot come at the expense of another people, because then it is the same cycle over and over and over again. So it is not a both-sidism. It is a call to say, what is it that we are actually striving towards, and how do we get there? Surprisingly, students have really they get this, right? You know who doesn't get it? And the reason I'm positioning myself in both schools is because I want to have a job in the morning, is administrators. Because they're all buying into this media trap that to be pro-Palestinian is to be anti-Semitic. To be safe return of the hostages is to be anti-Palestinian. Right? That the only way to peace is to bomb the village. Right? You've got to burn the village to save the village. Like, it feels like we haven't learned anything in 60 years. I'm sorry, I have to get off my soapbox, because this is just... So, the short answer to your question is, the students have asked a lot of us. I don't know if we've met that call, because they're so far ahead of where we are and where our schools allow us to be, that I don't know if we've adequately done them service, which means we haven't adequately done the cause service, which means that we are not actually achieving anything for the liberation of Palestine or for the freedom of hostages, because we're so embedded in white supremacy and in the subjugation of people that we cannot move beyond it in order to say this is what actually needs to be done.
Thank you. Should I move on, or would you like to?
Yeah, thank you both, all three of you, for your reflections. And I, just to begin with, I'm not teaching at Barnard anymore, although I'm still research scholar there. But I am deeply engaged with my colleagues there. And one of the things, as I've been following the protest movement, not only at Columbia and Barnard, but all over the country, is that there are two things going on, or there are multiple things going on. One is the protests themselves and the passion of those protesting, the passion to form a better world, a just world, and their right to protest. I've heard a lot of profoundly disturbing experiences of anti-Semitism, and I know there's also been experiences of Islamophobia. And all of that disturbs me profoundly. And there's also a matter in that I know I went to Barnard in 1985. And I had a huge Star of David oiled into my blackboard with a line, "To hell with the Jews," the first week I was there. And then, of course, I began to hear tales of other things, discrimination or remarks, or, the kinds of what we today call microaggressions vis-a-vis Muslim students or professors. So what we're seeing right now isn't anything new. I mean, some of it is far more physical, like people getting Stars of David ripped off, or their mezuzot being taken from their doorposts. But it's been there. It's for decades. And it's never been dealt with. It's like the racism on many of our campuses. And so to me, those of us who are teaching in these institutions, and those of us who have anything whatsoever to do with them, there's a call to address these things, to address the hostility. Is sometimes voiced and sometimes not. Sometimes it becomes just sort of the subtle undertow. But that it's really exploding now. And I am very worried about the coming fall. I mean, the tendency is always to say, whenever there have been large demonstrations, it's sort of like, well, May's coming soon and they'll all go home and, it'll be all right. I don't think it's going to be all right this time. Because I don't think nobody says that the war is going to be over, number one. And number two, we will have an extraordinarily divisive election in front of us. And all of us know that crisis moments in a society bring all the bigotry to the fore. So the anti-Semitism, the racism, the anti-immigration, the Islamophobia, the anti-LGBTQ+, all of that will heighten as we move towards election. Mm-hmm. So I hate to be such a downer, but it's real. It's true.
It's very real, and in fact, the very next thing that I wanted to ask you all about, which is that we're heading into the thick of an election year, as you've just said, and religion is very much a part of that conversation. And while most Americans might be able to cite the separation of church and state as one of our core national values, it's also very much under threat. There are not only activists but legislators breaking down that separation. I heard our former president at a recent rally say, if you don't like our religion, we don't want you in our country. Who we is and what our religion means in that statement, I'm not sure. And so to sort of combine two questions, do you worry about America retreating from its commitment to religious freedom, and how do we have each other's backs, particularly across our different traditions? How do we have each other's backs at a time like this? It can feel funny as a religious leader to say, I don't want my faith to influence public life, but we do have to let what we believe influence our civic participation. So how do we protect the separation of church and state, have each other's backs, while speaking out against you said that there's a lot of subtle undertow that's becoming very, very pronounced. So I saw you grab your microphone.
So first let me point out that this is, I'm going to do just a little bit of religious explaining. The First Amendment. Now the current Congress, and probably for the last 10 years, Congress have been very zealous defenders of the First Amendment, but unfortunately only the first few words where it says, Congress shall make no law. But the rest of it is respecting the establishment of religion. The separation of church and state is meant to protect religious from the predations of the state, but not the other way around. The other way around, we religious folks have a religious obligation to try and teach our neighbors a religious worldview that might help the country. We don't have the right to impose it as the country's doctrine, but we have an obligation to teach what we think is right. And that means that in the coming fall, and with capital F, the fall, we got to organize. We got to get out. We got to get out the vote. We have to do everything we can respecting our own view of what's right for the country. And you could be a right-winger, you could be a left-winger. You still have the same obligation to be out there working for the betterment of the country and the views that your religion teaches about civic engagement.
Actually, I don't think that the issue really is the separation of church and state, and if by that you mean religion and politics. Because people who really would, I mean, our Muslim and Jewish friends don't have to worry. No one is concerned that they're going to take over the government. It's really the separation of Christianity and the state that is the real issue here. And what's concerning to me is that, you know, one of the gifts of the Reformation was that it put the Bible into the hands of ordinary lay people. One of the crimes of the Reformation was that it put Bibles into the hands of ordinary lay people. Because most of these people who call themselves Christians have nothing to do with any religious community or church. They're simply people who went to Amazon and bought a Bible, and then they, you know, it's on their nightstand, and they just sort of make it up as they go along. But most of the people who are the people who most wanted to have the separation of church and state abolished really don't belong to a church. And so Christianity in the United States has become an odd thing that I think historically most people wouldn't recognize. And what people want is for that kind of Christianity and the state to meld. And that's very concerning. So I don't hear anyone saying, oh, we've got to have the separation of church and state. We certainly can't let some would say we can't let the Muslims take over, we can't let the Jews take over. But what they really, well, they would mean that. What they're really aiming for is that Christianity and the state be absolutely bound together, and the kind of Christianity is not what I understand to be historic Christianity.
I feel bad doing this at the last question, but I have to strongly disagree with my colleagues. I don't think we have ever properly had religious freedom in this country. Enslaved peoples could not practice their religion. Indigenous peoples could not and still cannot practice their religion, right? Ayahuasca trials were in the early 70s, right? We're not talking about a lifetime ago. The way Muslim practice was and is curtailed, because you tend to think about practice as the ritual worship, but charity is curtailed, which is an obligation, right? The fact that 12% of enslaved peoples in this country were Muslim and they could not practice their religion, that George Washington's famous or infamous letter to the Newport congregation for the Jewish community tells us that Jews were not able to freely practice. I mean, we can go through this historically and into the present period, that religious freedom has never been fully realized in the service of particular, and I'm not going to say categorically, I think I agree with you, in the service of particular understandings of Christianity, which are tied to whiteness. And again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but this is in fact what it is we're looking at. The types of Christianity that we see ascendant in the political sphere are ones that are intimately linked to questions of white supremacy, right? Charlottesville is the Jews will not replace us, or they will not replace us. That is the type of Christianity that is incumbent in here. What you hear coming out of university, to your earlier question, university presidents' mouths right now are more genteel ways of saying the exact same thing. And I'm talking specifically Columbia's president, Manu Shafiq, who's Egyptian, and is, can you be a white supremacist when you're not white? Yes, thank you, President Shafiq. Case Exhibit A, make it easy for me. Okay, so I say this to say that I don't think we've ever realized religious freedom in this country because we haven't dealt with many of our, and I'm going to use theological language, original sins of founding of the nation. And until we grapple with that, we cannot actually deal with questions of religious freedom. And so when I hear the former president say, if you don't like our religion, right, it's not new. This is in fact quite cyclical. It is in fact part of our national historical narrative. Let's own it, and let's say he is in fact not an aberration. He is an ongoing trajectory that will get more and more extreme until we undercut or pull this out by the root and face these challenges head on. So.
They've said it all.
Said it all. Well, then maybe we'll turn to audience questions, and a reminder that there's still time to share questions if you have them. And the first is, can you please address the issue of faith washing? I really respect interfaith work, but I'm often wary of how it gets used to rewrite global issues and make them seem as if they are fundamentally about religion when the reality is much more complicated, such as with the Israel-Palestine conflict, which is often presented as an issue of Muslims and Jews not getting along. As a focus of interfaith dialogue, a focus of interfaith dialogue would then be a misdiagnosis of the problem, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Yes. You cracked it.
Could you reframe the question for me, please?
Can I reframe? Okay.
It's not a question.
Yeah.
There's an echo in the room.
Sure. So it's about faith washing and sort of recasting complex global issues of history, boundaries, geopolitics as issues of, it's about these two faiths not getting along. It's just Jews versus Muslims.
Yes, and you can do that. It's like Ireland is about Protestants and Catholics. Mm-hmm. Just multiply those things. And very often it's about economics.
You want to use your mic? Sorry, I just realized. I can hear you.
Very often these questions are more about economics and social class. They may be about dialects, linguistic dialects. But one of the things that this also highlights for me is the ways in which our religious traditions are not just theological in the sense of we study our traditions, here we go. They are indeed religious cultures. For example, I was talking with Pat about a friend and colleague who is the Episcopal associate priest next door to my parish in the Church of the Nativity. And when we engage, in terms of the way we reflect on things, is about a kind of religious culture. It's where do our knees, the knees jerk, And how is the world? It's a much broader and deeper and richer thing than theology books. And similarly, the kinds of issues of, I think of even what's going on, Israel and Palestine, the last 100 years. It's also about land. It's about a home. It's about more than simply what do I believe. It's about a kind of a whole human reality. So, yes, that's a wonderful question.
I will. I just want to jump in quickly on that, because I think what Celia's pointing to, and I think this is so important, is that religion does not exist outside of the world. It exists in the world. So you can talk about religion. I don't want to, just like I don't want to over-determine the role of religion, I don't want to under-determine the role of religion, right? It means something to people. But there are all these other economic, social, political, linguistic, cultural factors that come into play. And also think about global narratives, right? So some of you may remember the Iran-Iraq war from 80 to 88. This is a eternal conflict between Sunni and Shi'i communities. The problem is Iran is predominantly Shia, yes, which would imply that Iraq is predominantly Sunni. But as we know since our second invasion, that in fact Iraq is predominantly Shia. So how is it a Sunni-Shi'i war when both countries are Shia? But it's a really great narrative if you want to sell people who don't know anything, make it a religious conflict, an eternal conflict that's intractable, that it's these savages at war with one another, and therefore we, the great civilizing arms dealer, must come in and settle. And so, right, this is the recreation of colonialism through capitalism, as opposed to mercantilism. And thinking then as well, when you think about Israel and Palestine, how can it be, Jerusalem is Israel is pockmarked with incredibly important religious sites, right? The Arabic word for Jerusalem is Al-Quds, the holy, right? So yes, there is a religious component here, but if I took away the Hadith sisters and I asked you to name famous Palestinians, who would you come up with? Edward Said, Christian. Hanan Ashrawi, Christian. Saib Christianish? Christianish. I think he's from a mixed family, which is, I'm making a joke, but I think he's from a mixed family. Right, so how do you make this a Muslim-Jewish issue when 30% of Palestine was once upon a time Christian, right? When we see Catholic and Anglican churches being shot at during this invasion of Gaza, during Christmas, how do we say this is a Muslim-Jewish conflict, right? And so the second you make religion, it becomes an easy thing, and we know who the good guys are, and we know who the bad guys are. The second you actually start bringing in these other issues, you're like, oh, this is complex, I have to think about it. Don't want to do that, thank you. Can I put on Netflix and please continue bombing, right? And so we've got to understand why religion is a useful media tool to engage us. And I just want to say one last thing about Edward Said, because he writes, everybody talks about Orientalism, which if you don't know, you should read, but the second book in his trilogy was covering Islam, where he says there's a relationship between governmental and non-governmental organizations, media and academia, to create narratives of neo-colonialism. He doesn't use the word neo-colonialism, but to create these narratives that tell us who we need to bomb next, that have totally divorced from reality. It's just about furthering our own political ends. And I think religion plays a huge role in that. Covering Islam.
Thank you all. I'm just going to do a couple more questions. We won't have time for all of our audience questions, but thank you. So the first is about doctrine. Do you think the God we all believe in is the same and we have different ways of approaching our relationships with God? Or do you think that the religions represented tonight believe in different gods?
There's actually a scholarly debate about that.
Oh, yeah.
My opinion, we believe in a God who's bigger than anything we can imagine. And our religious traditions are ways of reflecting that. And sometimes I think the difficulty is trying to put God in a box. And but I do think it's the same God. And I think that one of the things that interreligious dialogue, in whatever shape it takes place, it teaches me more about that God. And I remember a number of years ago, a scholar of Islam, a Catholic scholar of Islam, was giving a talk about his experience of a lifetime in dialogue with Muslims. And he said what he learned in that was the sense of transcendent that he, as a Christian, simply didn't have. Yes, we know that God is transcendent. We're taught that from the time we're little. But there is a texture to that belief that's a very humbling thing for those of us who don't participate in that tradition. So, and that's the same God. I don't know, what do you think? Do you think it's the same God?
So, one of my favorite scholars from antiquity wrote a letter to a friend of his, and he said that God is so complicated that there, by definition, must be more than one way to approach the one God, which I really appreciate. I should contextualize it because the man who wrote it was Symmachus, and he wrote it to his colleague Praetextatus, and they were both pagan.
I'll come at it from a different way, which is if we worship different gods, that implies that there is more than one God.
Right.
As a Muslim, that is antithetical, talking about exclusionary language, right? We can't be worshiping different gods if God is one. But I love the way you framed that God is greater. Right, the expression in Arabic is Allahu Akbar, God is greater. And it's an open comparison. So when Muhammad Ali says that I am the greatest, Allahu Akbar, God is greater. God is greater than anything you can imagine. And I think that's a useful way to think about that.
What I thought of, there really are two questions there. And one question, the one way to look at this is, do the Abrahamic religions all worship the same God? And do all people who approach the holy actually worship the same God? And I think the answer to both of those is yes. But I really think just in terms of scholarship, there's sort of two different questions.
I think that's quite right. And just at the risk of editorializing, one of the questions that's sort of on the cutting room floor is, this is a dialogue that would be harder if we had a broader selection of religions, if we went beyond sort of the Abrahamic Trinity.
Well, that was slick.
So just to recognize that, and in some ways, interfaith dialogue can often too easily stray to the easy places. And I appreciate, Hussein, what you said earlier about, like, there's a lot of stuff about love, and, like, that's a little too much for me. It's not quite right. But that's often where this conversation stays. So I want to thank you before we get to our last questions for bringing us past that to a deeper place and recognizing that this is in a lot of ways just the beginning, just scratching the surface.
Could I just say one quick thing?
Yes.
I think
Correct
maybe
me.
having somebody here who was not Abrahamic would actually be easier. Because, I mean, Christians in the 4th century wrestled significantly with whether the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament were in fact the same God. That's a very naughty question. But the question of whether the various gods of the Hindus and the Christian God are really the same, it's somehow less fraught, I think.
I wrote a whole thesis about that in southern India and how it is so fraught, but I won't go into it. A lovely question that maybe speaks to the wider communities that sort of you bring with you into this room is, how can I get more involved in interfaith issues, dialogue, community, etc. in New York City?
Is Chloe Breyer still here?
No, I think she could just come earlier to see you
okay.
all.
Okay. There are multiple ways to do this. One of them is through the Interfaith Center of New York, right?
Mm-hmm.
And back of the Barnard campus. They do multiple programs on religion, the religions of of New York, in the religious communities of New York, there are different groups throughout the city, and you might try and see if depending on where you're living, whether there's a group in your neighborhood. We have a group in our neighborhood, it's an interfaith coalition of 5 communities, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, and we have a way of relating to one another and doing programming that everybody agrees to. So I think there are local ways, and then there's a citywide way.
To jump in and maybe color the question a little bit, I'm sure a lot of folks here are from congregations of different faiths and might wonder, how do I go about approaching my neighborhood congregation of insert here if we don't already have a relationship?
Thank you for mentioning the Interfaith Center of New York. I'm on the board, and I'm terrible at advertising it. So thank you for that. And I was going to say, and I think in answer to your question, but also building off that, is find a protest. That's where the good religious people are. Just find a protest. You'll make friends. It'll be fine. It'll be okay. Wear a mask. It's still COVID. But I think, for me, questions of... I think congregational interfaith is useful and important, and also recognize that there are huge power differentials in congregational interfaith. This is a rhetorical question, but if I were to think how many Muslims were in this audience, that's a question of power. It's not because I'm not advertising, it's because resources, class, comfort level, socialization, huge power differentials in congregational interfaith, right? So just be conscious of that when you do reach out, which is why I think civic engagement is always a more neutral space to Sue's point, is that a lot of what the Interfaith Center does is through refugee resettlement, through immigrant training, right? Is what is the neutral avenue that people are called to do anyway congregationally, and then how do you build on that? So meet people where they are instead of expecting them to meet you where you are, which is why I think street protests are another great way, because sometimes, just like university leaders are deeply out of touch with the people they're leading, I would argue many of our congregational leaders are, no offense, deeply out of touch with the communities that they're leading. I don't know.
We don't have a congregation.
So there you go. It's easier. Not in touch at all. So there's, right, but thinking, just, be mindful of that and the types of community you want to build is the other thing.
I also want to commend Google. Anybody who's interested in interfaith programming can simply type in New York City interfaith programming this weekend, and Google will spit out a dozen possibilities for you. Pick the one you like.
And I'll just add a plug for Interfaith Coalition on Homelessness and Housing. Yes. So last question, with a little added color. I'll say the question is, who is an individual in your life, a hero of sorts, that inspired you in your interreligious work? And I'll add to that, can you say a word about the value of interreligious relationship? What has it meant to you to cultivate relationships and friendships with people who believe differently?
My heroes in this originally were my mom and dad. My mom was a Catholic Christian who grew up in Mississippi. Her family came here in 1639 with the Maryland settlement. And my father was from an immigrant Jewish family from the Bronx. And they did not come with the settlers. And they met in the Navy. This is a war story, literally. And so I grew up in a multi-faith household in a time when there weren't many, and in an area of the country where there was a great deal of anti-Semitism. And with a sense that we were profoundly different. And with two parents, my mother never tried to convert my dad. In fact, she sent him back to the synagogue because she said, "You are sitting on the fence." And so that taught me, in the way they were with one another, whenever I would hear them, and usually overhearing, like kids overhear, questions of religion, it was the curiosity questions. How do you, if you believe this, well, what about that? And they thought it was interesting, by my mother's words. And so that taught me, that there was suffering in the world that did not need to be, because I was also aware of the Shoah, and that something needed to change. And on the other hand, that people were together in a way that was loving and dialogical. I didn't even have the word, obviously, but they were my first heroes. And then I joined a community for whom that is a prime commitment, and had the privilege of living with some really great women. So those were my first heroes.
I'm going to skip the hero part because it depends on the day of the week and the time of the day. Right? Because there's a lot that goes into making you a person. There are a lot of people that go into making you a person. But I think, for me, the value, I don't think you know who you are except through difference. And so to figure out what it means for me to be a Shi'i Muslim comes from engaging with people who are not from my tradition. And it is the questions that I would ask any one of you on the panel that I am most afraid to ask myself, that are the ones that I have to start asking myself, that lead me to, right? Because if I'm comfortable asking you a question, am I comfortable asking myself the question? If the answer is no, start there, and then asking myself the question, then moving forward.
Can I jump in? He was certainly my hero, but he was also my rabbi. And I'm talking about a professor of New Testament at the Union Theological Seminary who was a Roman Catholic priest. So he was at a Protestant seminary, a Roman Catholic priest. May he rest in peace, Father Raymond Brown. And Ray, once I sat in a class of his, I think on the Gospel of John, which he had done the anchor commentary for, he realized that he had a rabbinical student in his class. And from that moment on, Ray never wrote a word, published a word about Judaism without asking me to read it, because he wanted to be sure that even though he was writing as a scholar about something that happened in the first century, that a 20th century Jew would not take offense. And it turned out to be a wonderful friendship, an extraordinary friendship, and he was a great, great teacher and a hero to so many, but I happily count him as my rabbi as well.
Give you the last word.
Well, I'm with Hussein actually, but there is one person that comes to mind who's not exactly a hero of mine, but has sort of really touched me deeply, and it's someone I've spoken to, my friend Anne, who just died, and I buried it. And Anne was a Jew who converted to Christianity in the Episcopal Church. And she lived with this dichotomy, with this struggle of trying to make sense of the fact that she was and always would be a Jew, but found herself wanting also to be a Christian. And just in my dialogue with her over the course of, the 40 years that I knew her, she embodied an interreligious dialogue, and that was very touching for me and also very challenging for me, because frankly, it was very challenging for her.
on that note, please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists. And thank you all for coming. Thank you.